The morning of the formal mate ceremony announcement arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed almost cruel in its beauty. The sun shone bright and warm, the birds sang in the castle gardens, and the sky was a brilliant blue unmarred by a single cloud. It was the kind of day that should have been filled with joy and celebration. Instead, it was a day of confusion, betrayal, and devastating public humiliation. Era had not slept. She'd spent the entire night in her small room, her hands trembling, her mind spinning with anxiety. Thane had left her at midnight, returning to his own chambers to avoid suspicion. In just a few hours, everything would change. The ancient binding ritual would be performed in secret chambers beneath the castle. And then, before the entire kingdom gathered in the Great Hall, she would be presented as the Alpha King's chosen mate. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to either soar or fall. By mid-morning, the Great Hall of Shadowmere Castle was packed to bursting. Every wolf of standing in the kingdom had been invited to witness the Alpha King's mate ceremony announcement. It was the most important ceremony the kingdom had seen in a generation. The noble houses were represented in full regalia. The pack elders sat in their places of honor, their ancient faces grave and contemplative. The council members occupied seats of privilege, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. The air in the hall was thick with anticipation and whispered speculation. Thane entered first, dressed in all his royal finerie, a magnificent black tunic embroidered with silver wolves, a cloak made from the hide of an ancient beast, his crown of gold and moonstone gleaming in the light of 1,000 candles. He carried himself with absolute authority, his presence commanding every eye in the hall. Behind him came Era, and the moment she stepped through the doors, the entire hall seemed to draw in a collective breath. She wore a white gown that had been mysteriously delivered to her chamber, a dress that was both elegant and simple, beautiful without being ostentatious. Her dark hair had been braided by someone who knew what they were doing, adorned with silver ribbons and small pearls. She looked like she belonged in this hall. She looked like she could be Luna. But the looks on the faces of the nobles told a different story. Confusion. Shock. Outrage. These were the emotions she saw reflected back at her as she walked toward the Alpha King. Some nobles leaned toward each other, whispering furiously behind their hands. Some stood to their feet in protest. Others simply stared in disbelief, as though they were watching a dream that made no sense. Thane took her hand and guided her to stand beside him at the front of the hall. His touch was gentle but possessive, a clear statement of claim and protection. Era's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone in the hall must be able to hear it. An elder council member stood to address the assembly. His name was Lord Marcos, and he was one of the most respected wolves in the kingdom. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of authority and tradition. "We gather today to witness the Alpha King's announcement of his chosen mate," Lord Marcos began, his tone formal and ceremonial. "The position of Luna is the most important position in our kingdom, second only to the Alpha King himself. The chosen Luna must be worthy, must be strong, must embody the values that our pack holds dear." He paused, his ancient eyes moving across the crowd, then settling on Era with something that looked like confusion. "The Alpha King has selected a." But he didn't get to finish. The doors to the Great Hall burst open with such force that several nobles jumped to their feet. A figure emerged, and the crowd parted like water before a stone. It was Prince Ronan Shadowvale, the Alpha King's own son, and his face was a mask of fury and desperation. Beside him walked Karen Blackthorn. But Karen was different than she'd been before. She was dressed in a gown of crimson silk that hugged her figure perfectly. Her red hair was arranged in an elaborate style, adorned with precious jewels. She walked with the confidence of someone who knew she was about to be elevated to the highest position a female wolf could achieve. And on her arm, she wore the mark of a promised Mateo, a silver bracelet inscribed with Ronan's personal sigil. The hall erupted into shocked murmurs. "I claim Karen Blackthorn as my chosen mate," Ronan announced, his voice loud enough to cut through the noise. The ceremony will take place in 3 weeks, as tradition demands. The effect was immediate and devastating. Thane's entire body went rigid. Era felt his hand tighten on hers. And in the prince's eyes, she saw something that chilled her, not shock, but calculation. This was planned. This was intentional. Lord Marcos looked between Ronan and Thane, confusion clear on his face. Your Highness, the Alpha King was about to announce his own choice of mate. Surely you understand that his selection takes precedence. I understand perfectly, Ronan interrupted, his voice dripping with false respect. But I believe a prince has the right to announce his own chosen mate, does he not? Unless the traditions of our kingdom have changed without my knowledge. It was a trap, Era realized. A brilliant, cruel trap. If Thane challenged Ronan's announcement, it would appear that the Alpha King was trying to prevent his own son from choosing a mate. It would make the king look tyrannical and controlling. If he said nothing and allowed Ronan to make his announcement first, then when he revealed his own choice, it would look like he was trying to one-up his son, like he was being spiteful and petty. And either way, Era's position was completely undermined. The crowd was watching both of them now, waiting to see how the Alpha King would respond. Era could see the calculation in the nobles' faces, could sense the political maneuvering that was about to take place. Thane was about to speak when Lord Marcos stood again. This is highly irregular, the ancient council member said, his voice troubled. The Alpha King's mate ceremony should take precedence over all other announcements. Perhaps we should postpone the prince's announcement until after Euro. No, Thane said, his voice cutting through the hall like a blade. His gray eyes burned with barely contained fury as he looked at his son. The prince may announce his choice. But let it be known that I will present my own chosen mate to this council as well. And the ancient laws will determine which announcement stands. The hall fell completely silent. Ancient laws. No one had invoked ancient laws in over a century. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and they could override the direct wishes of the Alpha King himself. Ronan smiled, but it was a smile devoid of any warmth. Then let the council decide. #### the revelation. For the next week, Era found herself trapped in a nightmare. The noble houses descended into chaos. Some sided with Ronan, arguing that the prince had the right to choose his own mate and that to deny him would be an injustice. Others supported Thane, claiming that the Alpha King's choice should always take precedence. Still others remained neutral, waiting to see how events would unfold before committing themselves to either side. Karen, meanwhile, had transformed into the perfect candidate for Luna. She attended every function, every ceremony, every gathering. She dressed impeccably. She spoke eloquently. She positioned herself as the voice of reason and tradition, arguing that Era was unworthy because she was wolfless, because she was a servant, because she was beneath the dignity of the royal line. But Era had discovered something that made her blood run cold. She'd been following Ronan again, drawn by whispers in her mind that warned her something was wrong. And she'd found him meeting with Karen in one of the castle's hidden chambers. They weren't alone. With them were Gartsayuro warriors who didn't wear the sigils of Shadowmere. They wore the marks of the northern territories. Era pressed herself against the wall outside the chamber, listening to their conversation through the heavy wooden door. You have to claim her, Karen was saying, her voice urgent and seductive. Tomorrow morning, before the ceremony. Call her to meet you in the garden. Lie about needing her help. And then take her as your mate. Once the bond is made, the Alpha King can't touch her. He'll have no choice but to release her. Karen, Ronan said, and his voice sounded exhausted. I don't want to mate with a servant. I don't want to mate with anyone right now. I just want a Euro. You want to survive, Karen interrupted. And you will, if you're clever about this. If you claim Era before the ceremony, the king will be forced to withdraw his support. The council will see that you've made a wise political move, preventing the Alpha from making a catastrophic mistake. You'll be viewed as the voice of reason, the heir who protects the kingdom's honor. And what do you get out of this? Ronan asked suspiciously. Freedom, Karen said simply. My family has powerful allies, Ronan. Allies from the northern territories. We can take this kingdom, you and I, if we're willing to be bold. But first, we need to neutralize the king's distraction. We need to prove that he's lost control of his wolf. And you can do that by claiming Era first. Era's blood ran cold. The northern territories. Karen had connections to the rogue packs. She was conspiring with the very forces that were threatening the kingdom. The king will kill me if I do this, Ronan said flatly. The king will respect you for it, Karen replied. Because when this is all over, when Era is bound to you and the Alpha's plans are ruined, he'll realize that you acted to protect the kingdom. He'll be grateful. And together, we can rebuild this realm into something greater than it ever was before. Era had heard enough. She had to warn Thane. She fled from the hidden chamber, her mind racing. But as she hurried through the castle corridors, she didn't notice Karen's servants following her, taking note of her movements, reporting back to their mistress. ### the ancient ritual. That night, Era made her way to the hidden garden for what she thought would be her final meeting with Thane before the ceremony. She had to tell him about the conspiracy. She had to warn him about Ronan and Karen's plan. But when she arrived at the garden, Thane was waiting for her with something different in his expression, a grim determination mixed with desperate hope. We move the ceremony forward, he said without preamble. Tonight. We perform the ancient binding tonight, before they can stop us. But the council Era started. The council will deal with it in the morning, Thane said. He took her hands and pulled her close. I've heard the whispers, Era. I know what Ronan is planning. I know about Karen's connections to the north. And I will not allow you to be used as a pawn in their games. He led her deeper into the garden, past the glowing pool, to a part she'd never seen before. There, hidden behind a waterfall of silver water that seemed to defy gravity, was a chamber carved directly from the stone of the earth itself. The walls were covered in ancient symbols, symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The floor was a perfect circle of polished stone, with more symbols carved into its surface. And in the center, there was a stone altar that looked as though it had been there since the beginning of time itself. This is where the first wolves performed the binding ritual, Thane said, his voice reverent. Before there were formal ceremonies and councils and laws. This is where the voice walkers forged their bonds with the alpha wolves. This is the oldest magic in our world, Era. And I'm going to use it to bind us together in a way that even the council cannot undo. He took her to the center of the circle and had her stand facing him across the altar. Then he began to speak in a language that Era didn't recognize but somehow understood on an instinctive level. The word seemed to come from the earth itself, from the ancient magic that predated civilization. He drew symbols in the air with his fingers, and they glowed with an inner light that left afterimages on Era's vision. He spoke her name and his own, calling upon the moon goddess, upon the ancient ones, upon the very fabric of magic itself to witness and acknowledge the bond. And then he took her hands, and Era felt something shift. The sleeping wolf inside her stirred, stretching, beginning to claw its way toward consciousness. The connection between her and Thane became suddenly, overwhelmingly real, a link that transcended the physical, that went deeper than blood or bone. She could feel his heartbeat as though it were her own. She could sense his emotions with perfect clarity. She could hear his thoughts as though they were being spoken directly into her mind. You are mine, his voice echoed in her consciousness. Completely and utterly. Now and forever. No power in this world can take you from me. No force can break this bond, I am yours, Era answered, her own voice joining with his in a harmony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The symbols on the walls blazed with light, so bright that Era had to close her eyes. She felt warmth spread through her entire body, felt the magic of the binding settling into her bones, into her blood, into the very essence of who she was. And when the light faded and she opened her eyes again, she knew that everything had changed. ###the ceremony hall. The next morning, the great hall of Shadowmere Castle was in complete chaos. Word had spread through the castle like wildfire that the Alpha King had performed a private binding ritual with the servant girl. The council was furious. The nobles were outraged. Some were demanding Thane's abdication. Others were calling for Era to be imprisoned or executed. Ronan stood at the center of the hall, looking pale and shaken. Whatever confidence he'd felt the day before had been shattered by the news of the binding. Karen stood beside him, and for the first time, Era saw genuine fear in those amber eyes. The Alpha King has violated centuries of tradition, Lord Marcos was saying, his voice trembling with anger. He has performed an ancient ritual without the council's blessing. He has bound himself to a wolfless servant without regard for the stability of the kingdom. This is a catastrophe. The ancient laws permit it, a different voice said. It was Aldrich, the kind healer master. He stood from his seat among the elder wolves, his aged voice carrying surprising authority. I have consulted the oldest texts. The Alpha King has every right to perform the binding ritual. It is an ancient law that predates your council, Lord Marcos. And it cannot be challenged or overridden. The hall erupted into outrage and counter-argument. But before the council could descend into complete anarchy, the doors to the great hall burst open for the second time in 2 days. This time, it was soldiers. Not the castle guard, but warriors bearing the marks of the northern territories. And behind them came a figure that made Era's blood run cold. A woman with dark hair and gray eyes that matched her own exactly. A woman dressed in robes that seemed to shimmer with ancient magic. A woman whose presence sent a wave of power through the hall that made even Thane take a step back. The woman's voice, when she spoke, carried an echo that seemed to come from centuries past. I am Morrigan of the ancient bloodline. I am Era Sylvain's aunt, and I have come to claim what is rightfully mine. And in that moment, as the woman revealed herself and her army of rogue wolves began to flood into the hall, Era understood that the real battle was only just beginning. Thane stepped in front of Era, his body a shield, his eyes burning gold with the fury of his beast. The transformation was beginning, his human form shifting, his wolf ready to fight. But Era placed her hand on his arm and stopped him. She could feel the bond between them, could sense his desperation to protect her. But she also knew something that no one else in the hall did. I know her, Era said softly. She's been in my mind since I was born. She's been part of the voices all this time. And as Era looked at the woman who claimed to be her aunt, she heard a voice in her Mindayuro, ancient and cold and absolutely certain. You will come with me, bloodline of my bloodline. You will learn the truth of what you are. And you will help me take this kingdom, just as we were always meant to do. The transformation had begun. And this time, it wasn't just about love or destiny. It was about war.